Jeff and Tal as we bring in NBC News national security and justice reporter Julia Ainsley. So, Julia, welcome to this conversation. You've got a handful of the president's allies who've been mentioned in this complaint. You've got the release of the text messages as well by former U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker. Who do you think is the most vulnerable here?
Well, it's interesting. Right now, I mean, looking at the text messages, there obviously opens up a wider universe. There are people who knew that the president was putting pressure on Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, and they are already bringing up the questions that we're having now, months later, about whether or not this should be in exchange for military funding. And then you get to that key piece of the text message where they decide to take it off of a text and onto the phone, which is often what people do when they don't want a record. Reporters do that all the time to be able to move to a place off the record where their notes wouldn't be subpoenaed if it came to it. So that the people involved in that obviously had knowledge, and the whistleblower really laid out a roadmap of a lot of names. But the more I talk to people within the Justice Department of the FBI and that community, the more the name Rudy Giuliani keeps coming up, because the Justice Department is still not ruling out that there isn't an investigation into Giuliani. They say the case is closed in terms of their review of whether or not the president committed a campaign finance violation just based on the notes of that call. And we can talk about whether or not they should have gone further in that investigation. But I've pressed repeatedly this week, could Rudy Giuliani also be facing an investigation and legal pressures? And I get a decline to comment. And in fact, I think it's something that could still be rolling out. So as far as legal exposure, I think it's Giuliani who is acting as if he were part of the United States, as if he were a taxpayer-funded employee doing the foreign policy of the United States. But in fact, it is to benefit one person, and that's the president.
So Gordon Sondland, talk about him. We know he is the United States ambassador to the European Union, and it's important to note that Ukraine is not part of the EU. But what are the House committees likely to ask him about?
Well, Sondland is one of those people involved in that text exchange that I described, where they say that this shouldn't be a quid pro quo. And so, of course, the House committees are going to want to talk to him this week about his time spent, what he understood. What was that conversation when it went off of text message to a phone call? And how much of this decision to withhold military funding came directly from the White House, if not the president himself? We talk about funding decisions that get made in Washington all the time at different levels, but this one seemed to go right up to the top, and it's clear from these text messages that these diplomats knew what was behind that decision.
Okay, former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, sorry. What is her story? What are the keys to her testimony?
Well, she was pushed out of that position in May, Alex, and what people are really going to be focusing on is whether or not she believes and has evidence to prove that she was pushed out as part of Trump pushing out people who aren't loyal to him, because we understand that she was pressured to make sure that the Ukrainians were carrying out this investigation. And this is in May. That would be 2 months before the president had this phone call with Zelensky. So you can already see the traces. This is even before Robert Mueller would have, or actually be after Robert Mueller's report, but before his testimony, before things had really been tied up, the president was already starting to put pressure on Ukraine to get information on the Biden specifically. And he saw her as someone who could play a key piece in that. And then when she was not willing to play, she was pushed out. So then the question becomes, was she pushed out for not being loyal? And what did that mean for our relationship in the region? Not to have an ambassador in the Ukraine right now at this really key time where they are fighting off Russian forces. What does that mean when the president is making his decisions, seemingly so, based on his personal beliefs and his personal interests, rather than the interest of national security and diplomacy of the U.S. and the world?
Ambassador, what Julia's just outlining there, after seeing the text from Sondland, a $1 million Trump donor, by the way, during the campaign, what do you expect from him on Tuesday when he testifies before Congress?
Well, first of all, I want to point out that 3 people involved in these text messaging are private citizens paid by outsiders. Both Ambassador Volker is also, he's paid by the McCain Institute during this time. And then you have Giuliani, who's not on the payroll. And the only one that is involved and paid by the U.S. government is Ambassador Sondland, who got his job precisely because he gave money to the inauguration. Not exactly the kind of team you want working on this issue. Secondly, it is clear, I think, from the record that Ambassador Yovanovitch was pushed out because she wasn't willing to play with this scheme that Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Lutsenko, the prosecutor general at the time, were trying to open up this investigation. Lutsenko and the ambassador had a lot of tension, and I'm sure once we get to the bottom of it, we'll know that that's why she was removed. And as for Ambassador Sondland, I have no idea why he is involved. He goes to the inauguration with President Zelensky. He's part of that team with Secretary Perry and Kurt Volker. But he has no jurisdiction, as you pointed out. The Ukraine, the EU does not have, we're not a member of the EU, and Ukraine is not a member of the EU, and yet somehow our EU ambassador is right in the middle of this. I hope there's some Ukrainian expertise that I don't know about that the ambassador has, but otherwise it just looks like he is a Trump spy, making sure that the bureaucrats are doing what the president wants them to do.
Interestingly, Kelly, overseas, our Secretary of State Pompeo referred to the Ukraine scandal as a, quote, silly gotcha game. And then he also said this. Here it is.
I think there's clearly politics involved in this. This administration was incredibly focused on making sure that we worked with Ukraine in a way that was appropriate. And it is not only appropriate, but it is our duty to investigate. If we think there was interference in the election of 2016, I think everyone recognizes that governments have an obligation, indeed a duty, to ensure that elections happen with integrity, without interference from any government, whether that's the Ukrainian government or any other.
Kelly, what do you make of that interpretation?
I think Secretary Pompeo is probably the most political Secretary of State, at least in my lifetime, that I've ever seen. And it's a little bit ironic given that, you know, he pretty much had a scorched earth approach to the Benghazi drama in the last administration. So to see him sort of say that this is being politicized, I think is heavily ironic. And also it's very clear to me that, that the secretary is, I think, struggling because he doesn't have very good explanations for some of this behavior and is sort of returning again to this 2016 election conspiracy theory. And to pick up on something that Mike said about all of this, whether it's Sondland's engagement in this, whether, you know, it's the content of those text messages. I mean, what we're seeing right now is pretty much the execution of a banana republic foreign policy. This is something that the United States shouldn't be doing. We have a reputation in the world that I think is slowly eroding because what's happening is you have people like Rudy Giuliani running these independent foreign policy plays on behalf of the President of the United States.
All right. I'm going to say thank you and a goodbye to you, Julia Ainsley, as well as Ambassador McFaul, Kelly Magsamen, Jeff and Tal. Not you guys. You get to stay with me a little longer. Meantime, taking control, the president's son-in-law gets a